In Apple's eyes, the world of ideal deployment is the user removes the device from the box. They connect it to the network. Device enrollment makes the user enroll in your MDM. MDM configures and installs apps, and the user is immediately productive and happy. I'm done. That's it. All right, thank you very much. Thank you. We are, but what if it's not ideal? What if maybe you've got a lab and you as IT are the user, not an individual user? So you as IT have to install stuff and configure stuff and are responsible for it rather than an individual user. What if you need to download lots of content quickly and you're in Australia? What if you don't want DUNS, or what if you're a company that doesn't want to register for the Dun & Bradstreet, so you can't participate in Apple Business Manager, so you can't do device enrollment? What if your network is on lockdown and your network admin likes to select checkboxes and lock stuff down? What if you have to bind to Active Directory before you get 802.1x authentication set up, so you need Ethernet, but no one in your organization has Ethernet because you've moved everything to Wi-Fi? What if stuff just doesn't work the way it should? That's our reality. But we figure it out together and we share our results. This is the state of Apple admin, is that we figure it out and share, or we complain and deal. And there's a lot of both. We figure it out, share, complain, and deal, and hopefully eventually figure it out, or Apple fixes it, and then it works. A couple things I want to talk about in my time, and I just realized I have a timer, but I didn't start it. So the Apple admin community is very strong. Got some examples to share about that. And then I want to talk about some of the state of some Apple deployment strategies. It's great to be here again. I was here in 2010, so I tried to look up on the site what I talked about in 2010. Doesn't show. So I looked at AFP548.com, which was kind of the state-of-the-art website back in 2010 for sharing our results, sharing our successes and our frustrations. Gary Larizza had a post about packaging and mentioned, yeah, we got to get away from this monolithic imaging. So this was 8 years ago. We were talking about, is imaging dead? Should imaging die? And the answer in 2010 was, yeah, imaging should die. We should move away from it. But we're still wrestling with that question. Adobe Acrobat, Adobe, yeah, this stuff. We're still kind of dealing with packaging, non-standard packaged software that's not distributed in standard packages format. We were talking about Server Admin, that tool that we use to administer Mac OS X Server. And I came back in 2012. We had some really cool sessions. The dynamic manifest generator hooked into Open Directory. That was awesome. I came back in 2013. This was here. We had some, there was talks on Git and Monkey, some really cool stuff going on. Server 2.2 was the state of the art back in 2013. And I stayed away for about 5 years and came back Tuesday morning. I landed at 7 in the morning. I went out to a colleague's K6 Apple Distinguished Educator School. We went out to the beach. There was a guy swimming in the pool, which seemed a little crazy to me, but I got plenty of sleep on Tuesday, woke up to a beautiful view Wednesday morning. I had my workshop yesterday morning, got plenty of sleep last night, went to bed around 10, got up around 4. It was dark out still. But thank you very much for having me back again. We have a great community, like I said. One place that I like to share information and look at information is the Mac Admin Slack. There's only 18,000 people registered right now. So if you're not registered for the Mac Admin Slack, please go to macadmins.org and sign up. We've got lots of workspaces. One is Xworld, where someone talked about the Xworld bingo. And I don't know if there's one this year, but maybe you could share it on the Xworld Slack. Another place in the MacAdmin Slack is the blog feed. And so I want to talk about some of the recent blog entries that were shared. Again, in this MacAdmin community, we share our solutions, we share our complaints. So Armin Bregel has a great weekly roundup of the news, and his site is called scriptingos10.com. So great resource from Armin. Mac DevOps just happened in June in Vancouver, and lots of really great sessions that are available on video from Mac DevOps, YVR. Here's Joel talking about Secure Token. Why is he talking about Secure Token? Well, because it's not documented. You go to support.apple.com and look up Secure Token, and there's nothing. So his session is kind of interesting. His theory is Secure Token doesn't really mean anything. It's just a tag that the tools use. It's not really cryptographically relevant. So don't worry about that. MacAdmin's PSU is coming up in July. That's a great source of more sharing within the community. Rich Troughton, this is another one of the things that was in that the blog feed. A recent post by Rich about automating Jamf infrastructure on Red Hat. Really cool stuff. Crypto.com, Charles Edge has got a post about, hey, here's how we can move from macOS server to something else. In this case, just macOS client. But he does some really great deep dives and shares that information up at cryptid.com. Richard Purvis has a great blog post about APNS and what you need to do to make sure that your devices are not locked down. Your network administrator doesn't lock stuff out for APNS to work. A couple words about MacAdmin's podcast. Episode 83 had a great. Episode 83 was great interview with Per Olofsson, the creator of Auto Damage. Can you show of hands of people who have used Auto Damage? All right, great. So Auto Damage is a tool that you use to create a never been before booted OS 10. But Per said, look, I know this tool is really cool, but I just wrote this GUI as a wrapper for a script that Duncan McCracken wrote. So we're building together. We're building a community. We're building tools together. We're building solutions together. This is just one example of that. Episode 51, if you haven't listened to that, it's with Ed. It's really inspirational, really good talk, and I can't wait to hear Ed talk again in 20 minutes. One of the cool things about the MacAdmin's podcast is every episode they do a community calendar, and they talk about what conferences are coming up next and what meetups are happening around the world. So this is a great way to give back to the community. I really enjoy it. Some of the people from Microsoft hang out on the MacAdmin Slack, and they put together this site called macadmins.software. If you go to that software, that is a URL. If you go to that site, you'll see here's all the Microsoft software in package format ready for you to download. And all the versions, which is kind of interesting how often this is updated. But they also have training available. So there are 3 modules about using the defaults command to populate, to change the way that Microsoft Office works, depending on whether you're using Office 365 or volume licensing or whatever. So really cool stuff that's available out there. A couple other community sites, MacBrained out of San Francisco, the itthinktank.io, the Command Control Power podcast. These are just people that are sharing the awesome. And I encourage you to share the awesome. So how do you share the awesome? You contribute your questions and your answers. Help the person that knows less than you. I guarantee that there's someone who's doing a job that knows at least one less thing than you do. You probably have an answer for that person. Just need to figure out where that form is to share that answer, to find the question and share the answer. So share your experiences, and just a plug to file bug reports with Apple, just so that when the project managers and the people who at Apple who determine where resources should be allocated, one of the things that they use is the volume of bug reports. So if like you're running into something with secure token and you don't know why and it's causing you problems with deploying 1013, file a bug and include information about how many computers that's impacting, so that people at Apple have the resources or the ammunition they need to, not ammunition, this is Australia, there's no guns, the resources they need to get the resources to fix the issue. One of the things that Tony asked me to address maybe was the question of, is imaging really dead? There's a website for that, isimagingdead.com, and I was tempted to include a QR code so you could go to that URL, but then rickroll you, but isimagingdead.com says yes, imaging is dead, but there's a link at the bottom of the page to the support article about how to install macOS at your organization. One of the cool things about this install OS is this. One of the cool things about the installer with 10.13.4 is the erase and install flag. The erase and install flag is kind of like erase all content and settings on iOS, where you have a new out-of-the-box Mac. It's kind of like that. You need the installer in your applications folder, and you need a script to actually run that with the erase and install flag. But it's getting closer to that ideal of being able to take a computer that's in production and then bring it back to an out-of-the-box state. Greg Nagel did an absolutely fantastic presentation at Mac Tech, and has all the links of all the things, all the resources about imaging. Highly encourage you to check that out. His site is managingos10.wordpress.com. But back to some of the Apple support articles about APFS and imaging. When Apple says don't do something, my initial reaction is, yeah, but I know I can. I can do it this way. I can be pretty clever and do it this way. But when Apple says don't do it, it probably means that doing that is going to break at some point. So a couple things I want to point out in this support article. That Apple says, when they say unsupported and unusable, that scares me. So if you use imaging methods that bypass the installer, they're limited and not preferred because important firmware updates won't be installed. This will cause the Mac to operate in an unsupported and unusable state. It seems like having things in production that are unsupported and unusable is not a good idea. The next paragraph, like iPhone or iPad, Mac computers often rely on firmware updates specific to their model. Like iPhone or iPad, wow, this is interesting that Apple's saying, all right, we're going to have more, this is going to be more like iPad or iPhone. That's kind of interesting. So 3 ways to install macOS that are supported: using Internet Recovery, also known as macOS Recovery over the Internet, creating a bootable external installer, and then with net install, which System Image Utility is going to be gone soon. Net install is going to be gone. Apple doesn't recommend or support monolithic system imaging for macOS upgrades, so don't do it. More information on firmware updates. This is really important. Don't try to package the firmware update and then install that on other computers. You really have to use the macOS installer. More information on the support article on how to reinstall macOS, and a little bit about, down at the bottom, about secure kernel extension loading, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Again, you can't install, now with 10.13, you can't install macOS onto a Mac that's connected over target disk mode because of firmware updates. It's got to run, it's got to look at the firmware that it's running on, and then apply the firmware based on the hardware that it's running on. So that's why you can't do it to computer that's in target disk mode. And they say, all right, well, if you really want to image, if you really want to create an image, you can, but it's got to be applied from one Mac to another with the exact same model number. So we're kind of used to the blasé thing of, hey, you create an image on your MacBook Pro and you deploy it on whatever Mac hardware there is. Apple's saying it's got to be the same model number. Yeah, that's Apple's saying, please use the installer to install macOS. So just a quick imaging recap. The only way to install firmware updates is through the installer app. The only supported way to install firmware updates is the installer app. If you really need to image, use the installer app to install macOS, get it up to the latest version of macOS, and then you can block restore an image. But again, only if it's the same model. So is imaging dead? All right. A few words about the secure kernel extension loading and user-approved kernel extension loading. Back in the fall, Apple said, hey, prepare for changes. We're gonna have to have the user give an OK before we load a kernel extension. And when 10.13.2 came out, there was it changed a little bit, and then 10.13.4. Here's the state here's where we're at now with 10.13.4. Enrolling an MDM no longer disables user-approved kernel extension loading. Extensions previously allowed to load for that reason now require approval. However, you can use MDM to specify kernel extensions that load without approval. This requires a Mac that is using 10.13.2 or later and is either enrolled in MDM via deployment enrollment or whose MDM enrollment is user approved. So either you have to use device enrollment through Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, or the device enrollment program, or the user has to say, yes, I approve being enrolled in this MDM. It's a little awkward because if you don't have that user-approved MDM enrollment, which is this kind of a new thing that just appeared midstream with 10.13, if you don't have that user-approved MDM, then you can't use MDM to manage security-sensitive settings. You want to have, the ideal world is you're using device enrollment through one of the programs for Apple device enrollment. More details in here in the support article 208.019 about kernel extension loading. Emily has a great article up at modtitan.com about testing your workflows in VMs. And she ran into an issue where the profile installation failed because her VM didn't have a hardware model associated with it. So she figured out, hey, I have to set a hardware model for my VM, and here's how you can do it. She pointed to another blog post by Ross about setting the serial number in your VM when you're testing out DEP. One thing I want to share with you for testing out device enrollment with an actual piece of hardware, not a VM, is this little trick that I heard about on one of the podcasts. I forget which one now. So you take a Mac that's out of the box at the welcome screen. It has to be running on APFS. You press Control Option Command T. So the three keys to the left of the space bar, that opens up Terminal. You're at the screen that says pick a language, and you can open up Terminal. Once you're in Terminal, you can do TM-util, the time machine util, local snapshot. That takes a snapshot of the state of your Mac before it's connected to the network. Then you can do the thing that you do to enroll your Mac with MDM. And if maybe you forgot to assign the device in Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager to your MDM, then it's going to fail. And you'll be like, oh, I need to wipe the device. Or maybe you forgot to assign the device in MDM to a configuration. So if you need to step back, or maybe your network is locked down too much, so the enrollment fails. So to restore to that snapshot, you start from macOS Recovery, select Restore from Time Machine, select your local disk, which is the source of your time machine backup, select the snapshot you made, but you have to do this within 24 hours because macOS automatically prunes those local snapshots. I haven't found a way to keep macOS from deleting that snapshot because it would be great if after 3 months of being in use, someone could bring me back that Mac and I could start from macOS recovery and choose that snapshot and then get it fresh out of the box. Well, I can't do that now. What about imaging iOS? I used to do it through iTunes. Kind of frowned on. So what about deploying iOS? I actually ran into some issues in the workshop yesterday. I gave everyone an account in my Apple Business Manager, one devices account and a content account. And Apple Business Manager requires two-step verification. So I set up a bunch of accounts, and each time someone logged in, I had to give them my code. And it was kind of fun because if like 3 people logged in at the same time, then I get 3 codes. So I'd read off a code, and then everyone would enter it, and someone would be like, oh, that was me. But because I had my phone open, and I just stuck it back in my pocket, I butt dialed my dad. And I didn't realize it, and he didn't get to the phone in time. So a couple minutes later, he called me back. So I'm doing the workshop, and I see my dad's calling, and I have no idea what time it is in Chicago. So I answer it. I said, hold on, guys. I answer it, and he says, is everything okay? And I said, is everything okay? What's going on? He said, oh, you called me at 12:45 in the morning. I couldn't reach the phone, so I thought something was wrong, so I called you back. I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I just, that was my fault. I felt really bad. The other problem that I ran into with the workshop is that I upgraded to Apple Business Manager a few days before the workshop. So kind of like live demo fire. And when it came time to use Apple Configurator to sideload content, I had people try to log in with the content Apple ID, the content managed Apple ID for Apple Business Manager. And Configurator said, yeah, no, you haven't used this with, this is not going to work. Do you want to upgrade this account? And I'm like, well, what's going on? Well, it turns out that I hadn't yet logged in on vpp.itunes.apple.com. So once I went to iTunes and logged in with one of my Apple Business Manager content managed Apple IDs, then everything worked out fine. But that was after the workshop. But we all learned that together. So I said, all right, so what about iTunes? Why don't I just download, rather than using VPP to deploy content with Apple Configurator 2, why don't I just use iTunes? And I was like, oh, wait, iTunes doesn't have apps anymore. So there's HT208079, which has, hey, here's the link to the iTunes version that has apps that you can download. So I downloaded it. It took a while to install, and we moved on. So if you sideload apps, then you can use MDM to manage that app later. But caching content services, that might make it so that you don't need to sideload content. That might make it so that you've got 200 people, they're all trying to download GarageBand to their iOS device at the same time. They're getting it from the local content caching services. Apple provides information on support article 208025 about, hey, we're moving the content caching service from macOS server just right into macOS. It's just in there. And you can use tethered caching. So when the devices that are connected to your ThunderSync 18 or 16 or whatever USB device you have, rather than using Wi-Fi to download the apps from the App Store or from the local content caching service, it's using Ethernet over USB to speed that up. And if you haven't seen it yet, in 10.13, in Activity Monitor, if you have caching content turned on in your sharing preferences, you'll see a separate button for cache. So this is a very uninspiring screenshot because I haven't cached anything yet, but this is a place to look to see whether your Mac is actually dishing out content. New feature that you might take advantage of is the ability to delay OS updates, both on iOS. So in the Jamf console, in the Jamf configuration profile, you can choose 1, 7, 30, 45, 60, or 90 days. Those are the options that Jamf has exposed for you. And same thing with Mac. You can prevent software updates for a number of days. So this allows you to make sure that all of your critical apps that you use in a day-to-day workflow actually work with the new version of the OS that Apple's made available. And so this is powerful, and this means that you don't have to do any like DNS jiggery-pokery and prevent the devices from being able to contact Apple for updates. So just as a quick recap for the world of ideal deployment, the user removes the device from the box. They connect it to the network. The device enrollment says, hey, you have to be managed by your MDM. The MDM then starts configuring and installing apps, and the user is immediately productive and happy. So that's the ideal world. This is what we're headed towards, but we're not there yet. I want to talk a little bit about the changes to Apple programs for deployment. That's device enrollment, VPP, Apple Business Manager, Apple School Manager. This is what I used to use. This is like a week ago. I went to deployment.apple.com, but that's old news now because everyone's upgrading to Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager. So this is the old news, device enrollment program, volume purchase program, the agent that creates admins. So that terminology is out the door. Now we've replaced with Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager. We've got the sidebar within Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager of people, devices, and content. And rather than the agent being the one master account that creates sub-accounts, rather than agent, now it's called an administrator. An administrator creates additional managers. That's just some terminology you're going to have to get used to. So some support articles about getting started with these programs. A few words about Apple School Manager. It was amazing to me that Shared iPad was released with a point release. Like, this seems like a huge world-changing thing that you can now have multiple people log in on the same iPad. And it was just like, oh yeah, it's a 0.3 release. It was just kind of astounding. And when that happened, when Shared iPad happened, all of a sudden, the fact that caching service cached iCloud content made a ton of sense. Like, oh, that totally makes sense now. Kind of like Touch ID. When Touch ID first came out, it's like, well, that's a lot of effort engineering to prevent people from having to type in a passcode. But then when Apple Pay and Touch ID, I was like, oh, okay. So keep this in mind next time Apple does something weird. Sometimes they do things that will make sense at some point later when they flip a switch and something is available that uses the feature that seemed weird. At apple.com/education/IT, Apple keeps a list of MDM solutions that work with, that Apple would recommend. And this list changed. It used to be 9 MDM solutions. Now it's 8. And I believe one of the solutions is gone and a different one has replaced it. So Apple's paying attention to what the MDM vendors are doing. A couple words about Apple Business Manager. When I saw the Apple Business Manager came out, people were like, oh my gosh, now I can use Apple Business Manager to create Apple IDs for my business users. But no, Apple says, don't use Apple Business Manager. These managed Apple IDs are not to be created for employees other than those who sign in and manage functions of Apple Business Manager. So Apple Business Manager is like Apple School Manager, but except for the managed IDs for students. So don't think that you can create managed Apple IDs for just regular day-to-day staff. I got a couple more minutes, 6 minutes. I want to review the updates from last fall, where when High Sierra was on its way up, Apple said, hey, we've got some information about APFS. We've got some information about File Vault and Boot Camp, APFS and file sharing. And APFS was just like dropped on us with a 10.13. It was kind of like, wow, this is big. This changes everything. But Apple shared this information with us in advance, which I appreciate. They had an article on here's what's coming for iOS 11, here's what's coming for High Sierra, and here's what's coming for macOS Server. I hope to see one of these soon for iOS 12, macOS Mojo, and macOS. Well, but I don't expect to see anything else about macOS Server. Here's 11, High Sierra, Server 5.4. I used to maintain a book about certification for macOS Server, and then that went away. And kind of like, well, lots of features of macOS Server are going away. Really only Profile Manager, Open Directory, and Xan are the services that are going to be appearing in Server. If you have Server right now, if you install Server, one other thing, in the Server help, they've got a link to a server migration guide. So if you really want to run these services on Mac hardware, there's a PDF that shows you how you can do it. Charles Edge has got a lot of articles up at crypto.com about a little bit more information about each of these services. But people are using other solutions to provide these services. If you take a look at the Server app right now, you look in the sidebar and you say, oh my gosh, these services are gone. They're really gone. They're not gone yet. This is Server 5.4. I go to the view and I can see all the services that, and if I want to enable DHCP, I still can. But in the fall, those services are going away. It's going to be Xan, Open Directory, and Profile Manager. And at some point, Apple Profile Manager didn't require Open Directory anymore. So it used to be always you'd had to spin up Open Directory. It would spin up your certificate authority, your intermediate certificate authority that it would use for Profile Manager. Now you can just start Profile Manager without Open Directory. Some really good documentation from the team at Apple. They all start with help.apple.com/deployment. The top one is relatively new. It's MDM. It's all the MDM settings. There's iOS, macOS, education, and business. Super good, relevant, up-to-date documentation from Apple. There's not much I can say about WWDC 2018. A lot of that's under NDA, and I don't want to get in trouble. So I encourage you to watch the videos from WWDC 2018, the keynote, the State of the Union, and the What's New in Managing Apple Devices session. I like when Joel Rennick said that macOS Mojave is where High Sierra got its mojo back. That was Mac Admin's podcast, episode 82. So if you go to Apple's site about Mojo, this is about Mojave, this is some of the public things that Apple's released, is that, look, there's a bunch of apps here that far from iOS, but now they're available on Mac. That's kind of weird. So, this isn't me saying it, but there's some speculation, like maybe we see the ability for Apple to move to a different chipset. Maybe that has some interesting ramifications. There's some sessions about how iCloud Keychain has been improved. Someone else has shared a screenshot about Safari automatically creating a strong password for you. There's some really, really cool stuff coming with Mojave. Just a couple days ago, some new features or new options for AppleCare for Enterprise were announced. This includes volume-based prices for 1,000 and 5,000 units, when you can replace 5% of your iOS devices and 2% of your Mac devices with no question. This is if you've got large numbers of Apple devices, this is really interesting. Something else that was just announced, it was a class book in Australia, and in the United States it's called something else. But this is just, like, it just keeps coming. This was recently announced. This is great for education. I haven't had a chance to use it because it's brand new. So my time's run out. I just want to recap what I talked about, that we have a fantastic, amazing community. I'm really honored to be a part of the Mac admins community, the Apple admins community. It's strong, and I encourage you to continue to make it stronger. And then I talked about some Apple stuff. So thank you very much. Ed Marzak is up. I appreciate your attention and your time, and look forward to speaking with you in the hallway. Thanks.